My name is Loretta. I am 62 years old, and my occupation is a retired high school principal. I spent my entire life building a sanctuary, a quiet place to rest after decades of hard work. But as I stood in my own kitchen staring at the piece of paper my daughter-in-law Chloe had just confidently slid across the granite island, I realized she saw my home as nothing more than her personal real estate. My hands began to tremble. It was not from fear, but from a deeply suppressed, justified rage that I had been swallowing for months. She looked up at me with a smug, self-satisfied smile. She was absolutely convinced she had finally trapped me in my own house, forcing me into the role of a full-time, unpaid nurse for her own mother. She thought I was just a tired old woman who would roll over and submit to keep the peace. She never saw the trap door she was standing on. This 4-bedroom house in a quiet upscale suburb of Atlanta is my ultimate pride and joy. I bought it with decades of carefully managed life savings and my pension money after my husband passed away. It was my reward for a lifetime of sacrifice. For 35 years, I worked late nights, skipped vacations, and poured every ounce of my energy into making sure my son Marcus graduated debt-free. I believed with all my heart that family always comes first. So when Marcus and Chloe claimed they were struggling financially, I opened my doors. I offered them the guest wing completely rent-free to help them get back on their feet. But Chloe quickly began treating my home like a luxury hotel. The subtle disrespect started almost immediately. She took over my kitchen, dictated the thermostat, and gave me passive-aggressive commands as if I were her maid. Whenever I voiced my discomfort, Marcus became her enabler. He would tell me that since I was retired and had so much free time, I should just let Chloe have her way. My own son made me feel like I was the unreasonable one for wanting peace in my own home. That shaky dynamic, that constant pushing of my boundaries, was exactly what gave Chloe the audacity to hand me that daily schedule. I never complained about the sacrifices I made. When you are a mother, sacrifice is simply the air you breathe. For nearly 4 decades, I poured every ounce of my being into making sure my son Marcus, who is now 35 years old, never had to struggle the way I did. My late husband and I worked tirelessly. I took on evening administration duties, supervised weekend detentions, and worked through the sweltering Atlanta summers, while other families took relaxing beach vacations. Every extra dollar we earned went straight into a college fund. My ultimate goal was to see Marcus graduate completely debt-free, and by the grace of God, I achieved it. I wanted him to start his adult life with a clean slate, free from the crushing weight of student loans that bury so many young people today. My philosophy has always been simple and unwavering. Family comes first, no matter what. So when Marcus and his 32-year-old wife Chloe came to me last year, claiming they were drowning in sudden rent increases, I did not hesitate. I opened my home to them. I told them to pack their things and move into the spacious guest wing entirely rent-free. I told Marcus to use this time to save his money, get back on his feet, and build a solid foundation for their future. I envisioned a peaceful living arrangement where we would share Sunday dinners and build a stronger bond. I truly believed my generosity would be a bridge that brought us closer together during a difficult season. Instead, it became the very weapon Chloe used to dismantle my peace. Almost from the very first day their boxes were unpacked, Chloe began treating my home like a luxury, all-inclusive resort, and she treated me like the unpaid staff. It started with what I desperately tried to dismiss as minor boundary testing. I would wake up in the morning to find my carefully organized kitchen completely rearranged to suit her exact preferences. Then I noticed the thermostat was constantly cranked up to 80 degrees because Chloe found the house slightly drafty, completely disregarding my own comfort or the rising utility bills. Soon the subtle disrespect escalated into direct passive-aggressive commands. She would leave towering piles of dirty laundry right next to the washing machine, and casually mention how helpful it would be if I just ran a quick load, since I was already home anyway. Whenever I tried to firmly set a boundary or gently remind her that this was still my house, the tension in the room would instantly thicken. But the most painfully disappointing part was not Chloe. It was Marcus, my only son. The boy I sacrificed absolutely everything for became her completely willing enabler. Instead of standing up for the mother who gave him everything, he would pull me aside, lower his voice, and systematically make me feel like I was the root of the problem. He would sigh heavily, give me a condescending look, and say, "Mum, you are retired now. You have all this free time on your hands. Just let Chloe have her way. It is only temporary and it keeps the peace in the house." He actively used my deep love for him to gaslight me, making me feel completely unreasonable for simply wanting to feel respected and comfortable in the home I paid for. That shaky, toxic dynamic slowly eroded my authority under my own roof, paving the way for Chloe to execute her plan. The breaking point began on a completely unremarkable Tuesday evening, when Chloe casually announced that her mother Brenda was coming for a quick weekend visit. Brenda was a 60-year-old woman who constantly complained of vague, unspecified ailments, but seemed perfectly capable of demanding everyone cater to her every whim. I did not object to a short visit. I simply nodded and prepared the guest bedroom downstairs. But that quick weekend seamlessly bled into an entire week, and Brenda showed absolutely no signs of packing her bags. The true nightmare began the following Friday morning. I was sitting on my back porch drinking my coffee when a large rented moving truck backed aggressively into my driveway. The driver's side door opened and out stepped Chloe's older brother, Malik. Before I could even ask what was going on, Malik dropped the metal ramp and started unloading heavy cardboard boxes. Then came the unmistakable heavy metal frame of a motorized adjustable hospital bed. I watched in absolute shock as Malik and a hired helper began hauling this heavy medical equipment straight through my front door and directly into my beautiful first-floor study. I immediately stepped in front of the doorway, demanding to know what on earth they thought they were doing in my house. I told them my study was not a storage unit, and Brenda was supposed to be leaving. Instead of offering an apology, Chloe immediately launched into a theatrical display of victimhood. She grabbed her phone, called Marcus at his office, and started sobbing hysterically. I could hear her screaming through the receiver that I was a completely heartless monster. She cried real tears, telling my son that I was aggressively trying to throw a sick, fragile old woman out onto the cold street. She twisted the narrative so quickly and so violently that I was left standing in my own hallway completely speechless. By the time Marcus got home that evening, he was already furious with me. He refused to look at the medical bed destroying my study, and instead begged me to just let them stay until they figured things out. The trap was springing shut around me, and my own son was the one holding the door open for them. Within 48 hours, the atmosphere in my once peaceful sanctuary became absolutely suffocating. Chloe and Malik systematically took over every single square inch of the living spaces. Malik practically moved in spending his days lounging on my expensive living room sofa, blasting the television and eating food I had paid for. The first-floor study was completely converted into a permanent hospital room for Brenda. But Brenda was not acting like a sick woman needing quiet rest. She began treating me like a hired maid. She actually brought a small brass handbell with her, and she would ring it sharply from her bed whenever she wanted a fresh cup of hot tea or her pillows fluffed. I firmly refused to answer the bell, which only made things worse. I was entirely isolated and trapped inside my own home. I felt like a prisoner hiding in my master bedroom upstairs. Whenever I dared to walk down the stairs and loudly complain about the absolute chaos, the mess, or the sheer disrespect, Malik would immediately intervene. He is a tall, broad-shouldered man, and he would deliberately step out of the living room and walk aggressively into my personal space. He would tower over me, forcing me to take a step back and point his thick finger near my face. He would tell me in a low, threatening tone that I needed to show some basic Christian charity. He loved using my faith against me, lecturing me about how a woman of God should be ashamed of being so unbelievably selfish. When I looked to Marcus for help, I found nothing but a coward. Marcus began working massive amounts of overtime, leaving the house before anyone woke up and coming home long after dinner had ended. He was deliberately hiding at his office to avoid dealing with the massive conflict his wife had created. He abandoned me to the wolves. He left his aging mother alone to face a hostile takeover of the home she had worked her entire life to buy. I was suffocating under the heavy weight of their entitlement, but I was still desperately trying to hold on to the hope that this was just a temporary nightmare. That fragile hope completely died the day I went looking for my tax documents. I desperately needed to find my property tax records, which I kept securely filed in the heavy wooden desk inside my study. That room was now Brenda's domain, but thankfully she was asleep in her adjustable bed, snoring loudly. I slipped into the room quietly and opened the bottom drawer of my desk. That is when I saw a thick manila folder that absolutely did not belong to me. Chloe must have accidentally left it behind while rummaging through my private things. I opened the folder and my blood ran completely cold. Inside was a fully drafted, entirely forged lease agreement. It explicitly listed Brenda and Malik as permanent tenants of my address, complete with a forged signature that was clearly meant to look exactly like mine. Pinned right behind it was a completed postal change of address form. They were legally tying themselves to my property. I felt physically sick to my stomach. I carefully put the folder back exactly where I found it and walked into my kitchen, my heart pounding violently against my ribs. I sat at the granite island and pulled out my mobile phone. I opened the application for my indoor security camera, which I kept on the kitchen counter to watch my dog while I was away. I scrolled back through the recorded video footage from earlier that afternoon. The video loaded, and there were Chloe and Malik standing right where I was currently sitting. I turned the volume all the way up and listened to their secret conversation. Malik was laughing out loud. He told Chloe that if they stayed just another 30 days, they could easily claim caregiver-tenant rights under the local housing laws. Chloe smiled that same smug smile and said it would be incredibly simple. She explicitly outlined their master plan to legally force me out of the upstairs master bedroom and relocate me down into the unfinished basement. She said I was too old to fight back, and that Marcus would blindly agree to whatever she wanted. They were going to legally steal my home and lock me in the cold basement while they lived in luxury. The emotional annoyance instantly evaporated, replaced by a razor-sharp, high-stakes reality. They were not just disrespectful guests. They were dangerous predators, and they were actively plotting to destroy the rest of my life. I stared at the black screen of my mobile phone for a long time after the video ended. Any other woman might have marched right out into the kitchen screaming at the top of her lungs. Another woman might have immediately called the police and demanded they be forcibly removed from the property. I did neither of those things. I refused to cry. I refused to yell. Screaming would only give them the opportunity to paint me as an unhinged, emotional, unstable old woman. It would only give them the perfect excuse to call the authorities on me first. Instead, I carefully locked my phone, took a deep breath to steady my violently shaking hands, and made a decision that would change the course of all our lives. I switched my entire demeanor. I walked out of the kitchen with a soft, compliant smile plastered across my face. I walked straight to the stove, took out my heavy cast-iron pot, and began making Brenda a massive pot of homemade chicken and dumpling soup. When Chloe walked into the kitchen looking for a snack, she stopped dead in her tracks, completely suspicious of my sudden change in attitude. I looked at her with soft eyes and told her that I had been doing a lot of thinking and praying. I told her that I realized how difficult this transition must be for her mother. I said the exact words they wanted to hear. I told her that family needs to stick together, especially during the hardest times. The change in Chloe was instantaneous. She let out a heavy sigh of relief, genuinely believing that she had finally broken my spirit. Over the next 3 days, my chilling compliance worked like an absolute charm. Chloe and Malik became incredibly arrogant. They walked around my home as if they had already signed the deed and cashed the check. They stopped hiding their intentions and became entirely comfortable showing their true colors. I would sit quietly in the corner of my own dining room sipping my tea, while they openly discussed how they were going to redecorate my beautiful living room. Malik loudly suggested they tear up my original hardwood floors and install cheap grey laminate because it looked more modern. Chloe agreed enthusiastically, adding that they should probably hire a contractor to knock down the wall between the kitchen and the living space, to create an open concept for when she hosted her friends for wine nights. They talked right over me, completely ignoring my presence, absolutely convinced that I was just a tired, defeated old woman waiting for my marching orders. They thought I was a harmless spectator in the destruction of my own life. They had absolutely no idea that every single time I smiled and served Brenda her warm soup, I was meticulously laying the foundation for a trap they would never be able to escape. I watched them measure my windows for new curtains. I listened to them complain about the color of my expensive paint, while they spent their days measuring my walls and ordering Brenda new medical supplies online. I quietly moved into action. I told them I was simply going to my weekly water aerobics class at the community center. Instead, I drove straight to the sleek downtown office of my estate attorney. I had known Mr. Davis for over a decade. He was the man who helped me finalize my late husband's estate, and he was a brilliant, aggressive lawyer who did not tolerate fools. I sat in his leather chair and laid out absolutely everything. I told him about the forged lease agreement I had found in the desk, and I explained their plan to claim caregiver-tenant rights. Mr. Davis was visibly furious, but he told me something incredibly important. Because Chloe had not yet submitted the forged lease to any official government office or housing authority, we had a brief window of opportunity to act preemptively and completely cut the ground out from under them. We spent 4 hours drafting the most ironclad legal defense possible. I legally transferred the deed of my beloved 4-bedroom house entirely out of my own name. I moved the property into a strict, irrevocable, living trust. I completely removed my name from public ownership and appointed a massive corporate trustee to oversee the property. This meant that legally I did not even own the house anymore. The trust owned it, and the trust had zero tolerance for unauthorized tenants, forged documents, or squatters. There was absolutely no legal loophole they could exploit. No tenant rights they could claim against a faceless corporate entity that explicitly forbade long-term guests. Once the ink was dry on those documents, I felt a massive weight lift off my shoulders. But I was not finished. I drove to the electronics store and purchased a heavy-duty encrypted external hard drive. When I returned home, I waited until Malik and Chloe were out picking up dinner. I connected my phone to my laptop and carefully downloaded the recorded video footage of them explicitly discussing the fraud and their plan to force me into the basement. I saved multiple copies. I backed the file up to a secure cloud drive. I saved it to the encrypted external hard drive, and I emailed a copy directly to Mr. Davis for his legal files. I gathered every single shred of ammunition I needed. I secured my castle. Now all I had to do was wait for them to make one final, unforgivable mistake. I knew it would not take long. Greedy people simply cannot help themselves when they think nobody is watching. I spent the next few days watching them closely, waiting patiently in the shadows of my own home. I was fully armed with legal protection and undeniable digital evidence. The trap was set perfectly concealed beneath a blanket of my feigned obedience. I just needed them to step onto the trigger. That fatal overreach finally happened on a Thursday evening, exactly 1 week after Malik had moved the heavy hospital bed into my study. I was wiping down the kitchen counters when Chloe swaggered into the room. She was holding a thick stack of printed papers clamped together with a heavy metal binder clip. She had a massive, victorious grin on her face. Behind her stood Marcus and Malik, both holding large suitcases. Chloe walked right up to me and slammed the stack of papers down onto the granite island. She announced that the three of them had decided they desperately needed a vacation. The stress of dealing with her sick mother had just been too much for her, she claimed. So Marcus had maxed out his credit card to book them a luxurious week-long Caribbean cruise. They were leaving for the airport in less than 2 hours. I stared at the suitcases, and then I looked down at the thick stack of papers. I asked her what the documents were. Chloe confidently slid the papers across the smooth stone surface until they hit my hand. It was a detailed multi-page daily schedule for Brenda's care. It was the most absurd, demanding document I had ever seen. Chloe had scheduled out every single hour of my week. It included strictly timed daily sponge baths, a complex medication schedule that required crushing pills into specific types of pudding, and heavily detailed instructions for preparing 3 specific hot meals a day from scratch. There were even instructions on how to properly massage Brenda's swollen feet before bed. Chloe looked at me with cold, dead eyes. She smiled that terrible, smug smile one last time. She crossed her arms over her chest and told me that since I was living in this house for free in my retirement, it was time I earned my keep. She actually looked me in the face and said, "It is your house, so it is your responsibility. Now do not mess it up." She told me that if I failed to follow the schedule perfectly, she would hold me personally accountable for elder neglect. She was practically vibrating with the thrill of her own perceived power. She truly believed she had orchestrated the perfect coup. She thought she was leaving me behind as a defeated, frightened servant who would spend the next 7 days bathing her demanding mother. She thought I would be entirely broken by the time her cruise ship returned to port. She thought she had won the war. She had no idea that she had just handed me the exact weapon I needed to destroy her completely. The sheer audacity of her demands, the arrogance of leaving me alone in the house after trying to steal it from me, was the ultimate provocation. I looked down at the caregiving schedule, and I felt a cold, hard smile slowly form on my lips. I looked back up at Chloe, staring directly into her arrogant eyes, knowing that the trap I had spent the last week carefully building was finally ready to snap shut, and it was going to crush them all. Marcus, Chloe, and Malik stood shoulder to shoulder in the main hallway. They had their expensive luggage gripped tightly in their hands, looking at me with expectant, arrogant expressions. They were simply waiting for me to nod, take the thick stack of papers, and verbally agree to their outrageous demands before they walked out the door to enjoy their luxury cruise. I looked down at the multi-page caregiving schedule in my hands. I felt the heavy paper against my fingertips. Slowly and deliberately, I gripped the thick stack of papers with both hands. I pulled my hands in opposite directions and ripped the entire packet violently in half. The sound of tearing paper echoed loudly through the silent hallway. I let the torn pieces fall from my hands, watching them flutter down to the expensive hardwood floor. I lifted my head, looked Chloe dead in the eye, and delivered the 6 words that would end her reign of terror. "I am not your unpaid nurse." Chloe actually laughed. She threw her head back and scoffed loudly, completely unbothered by my sudden defiance. She quickly pulled her mobile phone out of her pocket and waved it directly in my face. She threatened to call Adult Protective Services right that very minute and report me for elder neglect. She said she would make sure I was charged with a crime for abandoning a sick woman in my own home. I did not flinch. Instead, I calmly reached onto the kitchen counter and picked up my tablet. I tapped the screen, once turned the volume all the way up to maximum, and turned the screen to face them. The crystal-clear video from my indoor security camera began to play. Chloe and Malik's voices filled the hallway, loudly discussing their master plan to forge my signature claim caregiver tenant rights and legally force me down into the cold basement. I watched the blood completely drain from my son Marcus's face. He turned as pale as a ghost, his eyes wide with absolute horror as he listened to his wife plot to steal his mother's home. The arrogant smirk vanished from Chloe's face, instantly replaced by a look of sheer, undeniable panic. Malik took a step backward, dropping his heavy suitcase onto the floor with a loud thud. The absolute silence that followed the end of the video was deafening and perfectly satisfying. Before any of them could speak a single word in their defense, I reached into the drawer of the granite island and pulled out a thick manila envelope. I walked forward and firmly pressed it right against Marcus's chest until he was forced to take it from me. I told him to open it immediately. With badly trembling hands, my son pulled out the heavily stamped legal documents. I explained to them in a calm, entirely flat voice that I no longer legally owned the house. I told them I had successfully transferred the entire property into an irrevocable corporate trust earlier that week. The letter he was holding was a formal legal notice of eviction and a strict warning of criminal trespass from the trust's high-powered attorneys. Because they were not listed on any valid lease, they had absolutely zero rights to the property. Chloe began to stammer desperately, trying to formulate a new lie, but I cut her off immediately. I told her I had already found the forged lease hidden in my desk. At that exact moment, the heavy sound of a diesel engine rumbled loudly in my driveway. I walked to the front door and pulled it wide open. A massive private medical transport van was parked directly behind Malik's rented moving truck. Two strong men in clean medical uniforms walked up the front steps, holding a rolling stretcher. I turned back to look at Chloe and Malik. I revealed my ultimate twist. I told them I had already paid for a professional medical transport service using my own money. The team was here right now to carefully load Brenda her adjustable bed and all of her medical supplies, and safely deliver her directly to Malik's tiny, cramped apartment on the other side of town. Malik started yelling, screaming frantically that his apartment was way too small to fit a hospital bed and a sick woman. I looked him up and down and coldly told him that was his problem to solve, not mine. The medical team walked past us and immediately headed straight into the study to begin moving Brenda. I turned my attention back to my son and his deceitful wife. I pointed my finger directly toward the staircase. I informed Chloe and Marcus that they had exactly 60 minutes to go upstairs and pack whatever personal belongings they could fit into the trunk of their small sedan. If they were not completely off the property by the time the grandfather clock in the hallway struck the hour, I would make one single phone call. I explained that the local county sheriff had already reviewed the security footage and the forged lease agreement. Armed deputies were currently sitting on standby just 2 streets away. I promised them that if they refused to leave my home, law enforcement would arrive and immediately arrest them all for criminal fraud, attempted elder abuse and trespassing. A week later, a beautiful quiet calm had completely washed over my home. The house was finally empty of the people who had tried to destroy me. I spent the afternoon sitting out on my freshly swept back porch, quietly drinking a tall glass of cold sweet tea and listening to the birds sing in the trees. Every single lock on the doors had been professionally changed, and my home security system had been massively upgraded to ensure nobody could ever step foot on my property without my explicit permission. My heavy wooden desk was back in my first-floor study, right where it belonged. Marcus and Chloe never went on their luxury cruise. Instead, they were forced to cancel their trip and use their vacation money to rent a room in a cheap, run-down roadside motel. Word had reached me through a mutual friend that their marriage was rapidly crumbling under the intense weight of their massive failure and financial strain. Sitting on my porch, I closed my eyes and took a deep breath of the warm Georgia air. I searched my heart, but I felt absolutely no guilt for what I had done. I felt only a profound, unbreakable peace. It took a lifetime of hard work and sacrifice to build my peaceful sanctuary, and I almost let the very people I loved most tear it all down simply because I wanted to be a supportive mother. I learned an incredibly hard and painful lesson through all of this terrible ordeal, and it is something I deeply want to share with every single woman listening to my voice right now on her Golden Years stories. Please hear me when I say this. Love your family, but never let your love become the rope they use to tie you down. A mother's heart is soft, but a woman's boundaries must be made of iron. You have the absolute right to protect your peace, your hard-earned property, and your own well-being, even if the threat happens to be sleeping right under your own roof. Never let anyone convince you that your kindness is a weakness they can endlessly exploit. If you've ever had to put your foot down with entitled family members, hit that like button and subscribe to my channel. Let me know in the comments below, what state or country are you watching from today, and how many minutes did you stick around for this story? Your support means the world to me.